Ich switche noch mal kurz auf Deutsch, wobei unsere Inputs heute Morgen alle auf Englisch sind. Aber als Einführung, wie geht es jetzt weiter mit dem Tag? Also heute Vormittag werden wir uns mit zwei zentralen Fragen beschäftigen. Und die eine Frage ist vor allem, wie können wir in der Politik oder was können wir in der Politik und auch wie können wir das tun, von kollaborativen Ansätzen und Innovationen über die Sektoren hinweg lernen. Und der zweite Themenbereich ist, wie können wir mehr Experimente fördern. Und wir haben zwei spannende Lightning Talks. Und unser zweites Thema, wie ich vorhin angekündigt habe, ist vor allem nochmal der Blick auch auf Experimentierräume und Sandboxes. Und ich freue mich sehr, Indy Johar begrüßen zu können und ihn einmal auf die Bühne zu bitten. Indy Johar ist Co-Founder und Executive Director von Dark Matter Labs. Wir haben ihn jetzt schon auch hier angeteasert gehört in dem Lightning Talk von eben. Und yes, Indy, welcome. I'm excited that you're here this morning with us.
Good morning. I'm super delighted to be here. I wish we were all in person, but we are where we are. Thank you.
From where are you calling in today?
From London.
So from London as well. Excellent. Yes. So, Indy, what will your lightning talk focusing on?
So, I suppose one, it was just such an honor to follow from Jeff, Benjamin, and Kara, because I think they've set such a brilliant stage. And I suppose I want to focus on not the nature of innovation, but the mechanisms of innovation. And I will focus a little bit on where I think we have some critical transformation. So in a mild provocatory sense, I would say that we need to move beyond labs and sandboxes. And the kind of era of labs and sandboxes is no longer sufficient to deal with the scale of challenge that we face. So that's where I'm going to focus a little bit.
Okay, looking forward to it. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Super delighted to be here, like I said, and it's a real honor to follow Sir Jeff Morgan and Benjamin and Kira, because I think they've set such a brilliant stage and such a comprehensive position. So I suppose I will add to that as much as I can and start to bring forth, I think, what are the kind of spaces of innovation that are required and what are the organizational frames. I hope my slides are sharing. Is that okay? Just to test. It's a slide share. Can you see the slide?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Grand. So in terms of testing for a disruptive future, moving beyond labs and sandboxes, just a little bit around Dark Matter. We're a 60+ organization from Vancouver to South Korea. Actually, increasingly, I think we are conscious of the power of our autonomous nature, our independence. Sort of not-for-profit and public interest laboratory. That's where we're focused on. We're working with governments, national governments looking at their transition strategy, all the way from working with the European Commission as one of the partners on the mission, Net Zero Cities mission and its execution to various city governments around the world in various formats. So that's just a bit of context. And in terms of our skill base, we have all the way from designers to data scientists, all the way through to anthropologists in different formats. And so just to give you some context of what we are. So I'm not going to labor too much on this point because I think the point has been well made in both history and time. Increasing complexity and uncertainty, fine. And I think the next dimension that I think is worth us recognizing is actually the planetary nature of these disruptions. And I think these are sort of critical. I think one of the big challenges that we face, and I will point at this, is that it is increasingly difficult for single nation state or even meta-nation states or meta sort of frameworks to be able to resolve what are planetary scale transformations. And one of the big challenges that we face is that our innovation capacity is very much siloed into either state or parastate models, but we have very little transnational innovation capacity, transnational. So between nation states innovating together on issues. And I think there are very few alliances where we see around that. Well-being Alliance is one of them. Now, these planetary challenges rely on transnational sort of recognition of transnational interdependency. They rely on actually recognizing unmanaged liabilities. And I think this is one of the big things that we have to talk about, is that our innovations are responding to what are unmanaged liabilities, whether they're uncertainties or risks, but they are unmanaged. And largely what we're seeing is the cascading effects of those risks requiring systemic innovation capacity to be able to respond to it. We know that actually the nature of the crisis that we face requires continuous evolution and emergent responses, and obviously these are complex and connected. Now, I want to start by saying that I think one of the big challenges that we face, and why I think we need to stop looking at labs and we need to stop looking at sandboxes, is that innovation is increasingly contextual. And whether we look at the devolution agenda, which has, if you take the long arc of it, been growing, I think the devolution agenda of power, agency, and governance is a systemic response to actually the shift of innovation to being hyper-contextual as opposed to universal. The shift from universal innovation to contextual innovation, I think, is a very key issue because it demands new forms of capabilities. And I think we are maybe ending in an era of the universal price, the universal product, to hyper-particularized service, personalized service and contextuality. Second, I think our economies are moving from commodity-based economies to innovation-based economies, i.e. the creation of the new is fundamental to actually addressing, is such a structural component of value that the economy is moving in that way. And that means the new is always creating risk. So our theory of regulation, which was kind of regulating commodities, has to move to talk about how do we regulate innovation in society in a different way, in a systemic way, where innovation is not the precursor to the 1% or the 2%, but innovation is actually a precursor for a vast percentage of the population. And what does that mean? And there are, and this may sound grand, but you could argue that our health services are operating in an everyday age of innovation, where you see massive decentralized capacity, capabilities, and necessities for innovation in services and other formats. And we see that going on continuously. And the next point is actually recognizing how do we innovate in interdependency. So I think we've lived in a world which has been about recognizing that you can isolate ourselves from, we can have an object-oriented view on the world where we talk about things in vitro, and that allows us to optimize innovation to perhaps a single point of view. But actually, increasingly, the world is everything, whether it's an urban forest or anything, has multiple co-beneficiaries, multiplicity of co-beneficiaries. And the recognition of our intervention has multiple co-benefits and co-externalities is fundamental to our theory of innovation. And that requires us to operate with the duty of care. And I think reigniting the duty of care as opposed to the duty of single point optimization, I think becomes fundamental to innovating in interdependency. I made this point before in this kind of move from commodity-based economies and continuity economies to disruption and innovation-based economies, what that requires and what the emerging values are. Now, this sits, in my view, and sort of a lot of the work that we're doing on kind of understanding innovation as a response to knowable crises, so strategic risks that you have a portfolio of innovations for, preparing for crises that are knowable, i.e. building the capacity to be able to capacity and the capability and the funding instruments and the organizational instruments to be able to operate on new crises that will emerge. So that's the reorganization part of governments. One. And the third dimension is actually talking about an age of unknowable risk, uncertainty, and that requires us to build systemic resilience at a societal level. Now, why I put these up is each one of these, one is a portfolio-based response against strategic risks, building a portfolio of strategic innovations, and that is a risk and innovation response. The other one is an organizational response. The other one is a state, what I would call a whole nation state response. And these three things require different models of innovation fundamentally. And I think that's really critical that we look at it through those lenses. And in a way, whilst we talk about, whilst we could talk about managing uncertainty and risk, which is what I've spoken about, also I think there is a real critical need And I think a lot of what I would call the risk-oriented approach misses out is recognize there is a new potential on the table, a new potential of human-machine ecological development, an integrated idea of development and progress in a way that's not been framed before. And how do we unlock the capacity of society to operationalize this? And I know this will sound esoteric, but I will try not. I think James Lovelock in his book Novacene makes this case very elegantly. I would put forth that actually we're in an age where human-machine ecological systems are actually becoming entangled and a single global autopoietic system. And increasingly that entanglement is building a type of consciousness, a new emergent consciousness across those three things, which I think is fundamentally different to every other theory of organizing that we've had. And I think that planetary level operation, I think, challenges most of our structures on it, but also creates a new capacity of development that we've never seen before. So there is something in the idea of potential that we need to unlock, not just risk and uncertainty. The next dimension of this conversation that I would have is that it's really clear to me that, and certainly the work that we're doing, that we have to talk about foundational transformations. It is no longer enough to think that we innovate out in services. It is very clear that our democratic structures and forms are no longer capable of making societal decisions at the right scale and speed that is required. And that failure of societal decision-making requires systemic reform. And I would put forth in this group that this requires us to view, to recognize the reality that the constitutions and the parliaments that we have are design results of a particular generation, and we may need to review them in a systemic format. And I think this goes all the way through in what I would call the foundational transformations of society. And why I bring that out is that these sort of foundational transformations require different forms of legitimacy, different forms of democratic organizing, and different forms of what I would call financing. Fundamentally, they go beyond our typical models of value. Now, here, what I would like to put forth is that in order to do a lot of what we're talking about, we have to actually address some of the deep code challenges in society. Our innovation challenges are not services and outcomes only. They're actually fundamental worldviews which are buried into our institutional logics and our social imaginaries. Social imaginaries can be all the way from property rights to the idea of a private limited company. These are constructed social imaginaries that allow us to operate in the world. And I would put forth to you that I think there are 4 critical missions of deep code innovation that we need to transform. One is recognizing that we need to rebuild our theory of humans not as bad robots, but actually humans as agents of development, human development and discovery. How do you build the capacity for human development and discovery in a new way? And every revolution, like 1750s, the UK did educational reform before the Industrial Revolution. So when a human development has precursored every industrial technological development. And I think we're entering a new age of human development, which emphasizes care, craft, complex cognition, creativity, and these skills require a new way of human development, which is fundamentally critical. And as we move beyond, I would say, the post-managerial age, the post-procedural age, and that shift in human development is critical. Now, that's a deep structural shift. How do we move from our relationship with nature to being that one of resource to one of cohabitation? It's very clear that currently we're in a process of terminating nature, almost at a warlike level, our natural conditions and environmental base. That requires a fundamental shift in our relationship with nature. It no longer can be done as micro fixes. Our theory of ownership, which I think I would put forth to you, which is a kind of our relationship to the world, has been constructed for single point optimization. Ownership facilitates single point optimization and exploitation. Whereas actually, how do you construct new forms of relationship which go from single point optimization to recognizing the co-beneficiary effects of everything and our relationship as stewards in those frameworks? And then finally, our relationship with the future, which is almost certainly very much like nature. We are in a process of terminating futures, and we are at war with both nature and the future in a fundamental sense. So why I bring this up is this requires us to not just talk about single point product services. This is our fundamental shift in society. And this requires us to build new language, new culture, new perspectives of self. And these are much deeper forms of innovation in society than we traditionally are talking about. These are cycles of innovation that take, whether it's the Enlightenment and 400 years previously, where actually a reframing of our relationship in the world is done. And I think these are very critical because I think we face the same period. We face a period that I would argue is a 400-year transition, which is going from object to entanglement, 6,000-year transition, which is going from control, age of kings and queens, to learning in an age of complexity, and a much broader, perhaps even a billion-year transition plus, where actually the planet is going from single-cell consciousness to actually a multi-cell planetary consciousness. And these are fundamental shifts. Now, one thing I would like to acknowledge is the theory of lock-ins. When we look at this, it's very clear that we are locked into a past. And in history, we've been locked into many pasts. So whether it is slavery, we were locked into slavery, and the UK government had to spend 25% of GDP in the middle of the Engels pause to effectively abolish slavery. So there are many, many examples. When Denmark became bankrupt, it invested in human development, human education in 1819 to rebuild itself. And that human development model was around Volk schools, people schools, and various other frameworks. So I think we are both locked in at a conceptual level, at a language level. We're locked in sunk costs and capital assets. We're also locked in terms of our human development frameworks. And I could go on about this, but I think it's really critical. And when we talk about innovation, we have to talk about addressing the lock-ins. I will try to speed up the current landscape. And I'm going to sort of controversially amongst friends, sort of challenge the idea of AAA, anticipatory, agile, and adaptive governance theory, because I would say it still predicates an idea of centralized power in a complex emergent world. Whilst it makes it agile, whilst it makes it anticipatory, whilst it makes it adaptive, it actually still predicates the idea that there is a single actor that is able to do all this stuff. And as we know with information theory, the CEO of an organization has less than 7% of the information required to innovate, whereas somebody on the front line is probably closer to 60 to 70%. Now, this is practical front-end service innovation, but I think just to illustrate the point of information and information inequality in systems. So if we preserve top-down systems of innovation and control, I think we limit our capacity for systemic innovation. And that goes all the way through in many forms, our relationship to multiple models. And the challenge is the centralized control-driven innovation requires acknowledgement of the problem. So you have to build awareness of the problem in a complex emergent age, the resolution of understanding the tacit information, redefine the rules centrally, and drive compliance centrally. And I think this is fundamentally, at odds with the nature of the world that we're living in. Now, this is challenging because what this starts to say is that the idea of an industrial control organization, and most of our bureaucracy is designed through a theory of industrial control organization, is perhaps no longer fit for purpose in a complex emergent world. Heresy to say this, but I think there is something to be said. And I think this is based on, I would say, theories of certainty. The world will be certain, fixed, so you can do a plan and you can execute it. You can do certain capabilities and execute it. You can build an issue and execute against that issue, and the single perspectives. And increasingly, even in organizations, there is no single perspective. We need multiplicity of innovations occurring both at the service level, but also at the deep code level. And these innovations require proximity to those contexts. And I suppose what I would say why this is critical is because it's about driving contextual innovation, interdependent innovation, and the work is all about craft. And craft fundamentally requires a different theory of accountability, which cannot be vertically driven. Craft requires accountability to the context that you're working in. So it shifts the theory of power in a fundamentally different way. And so as we go from centralized to distributed parametric, and the parameters being fixed to being evolving, process being controlled to learning, actors being objects to entanglements, nation states, from nation state to what I would call systems and nation systems, I think we have to start to talk about a different theory in that model. Now, What this requires, I would put forward to is building the rapid learning capability and a new theory of optimizing in context. And I think that requires actually us to move from labs and sandboxes to whole organization approaches. It is, I think, inconceivable now, especially in an age where we're going to see cascading transformation requirements, risks, unknowns, and crises. I think we have to try to actually reimagine what is the 21st century theory of bureaucracy in an age of disruption at a structure level. And that has to go from governing objects, governing parameters, to actually being governing meta, which is actually how do you look at the learning capacity of the system? How do you build actually look at the quality of outcome, look at the real-time feedbacks into the system? This requires a different theory, I think, of organizing and governing in a fundamental way. And that requires all sorts of things, from the expansion of agency, from centralized egocentric agency to the whole ecosystem, distributing agency to the whole ecosystem. It requires, and recognizing that distribution of agency, it requires organization transformation from C-suite driven governance and innovation to organization to innovation being distributed through the system and to be mutually regulating. So how do we deal with our theory of risk and how risk and accountability is built? Because it requires a reimagining. It requires us to reimagine theories of how we construct permission and permission for innovation and change use. It requires us to look at our accounting models. It requires us to look at our policy and accountability models. It requires us to embrace multiple points of view. It requires us to embrace a theory of regulation, which isn't about control, but is about learning. And if we go beyond labs, I think what becomes clear is we have to move into a plurality of disruption. We have to recognize the plurality of responses required in disruption. And that requires a whole organizational response in different components. We have to reimagine transparency in the construction of legitimacy. It's very clear, whilst we've had some very good responses to COVID, actually very few have constructed the democratic legitimacy. And we are now in a crisis of the construction of legitimacy in society in this way. How do we construct many-to-many value and many-to-many architectures into that theory? How do we enable rapid learning into that model? These are actually going to be critical functions. And as we go towards that rapid learning and hyper-contextualization frameworks, that's a really fundamental shift in organizational design. So building resilience, building system approaches, building real-time responses, building learning capacity is almost the fundamental capabilities required at a whole institutional level to be able to respond to that. And so in reorganizing for the future, I think we have to recognize innovation on the front line, and everything is on the front line, right? A C-suite is on the front line of language and taxonomy. Services are on the front line, actually frontline staff. It requires us to actually distribute risk management and strategic innovation capabilities. It requires us to build, and this is really important, increasingly many of our staff are working in deeply precarious, completely unknowable situations. So the psychological stress of staff that are having to innovate and deal with risk continuously requires us to build a new platform of care, security, and creativity, which actually creates a safe territory for that. How do you build open documentation and learning mechanisms? Our theory of leadership is no longer about leadership and followership, but leadership and discovery. And that embraces the whole organization and your acts of that leadership. And also working in care, because we know with everything we touch multiple co-beneficiary and co-externality effects. So how do we operate as a model of care? And finally, perhaps most critically, how do we do the deep code innovations that go from the language, the accounting rules, the structural things that predicate our responses? And I think this is about reimagining the organization at a structural level. And many of the things I talk about, we've written about in much of our work. But what I would say is that this goes from everything, how an organization makes decisions, the pay of an organization, because suddenly the asymmetric pay differential between a CEO and frontline staff is different, because it can no longer be justified in the same model. So I think it changes our models of actually what does safety and security really look like? How do you build learning? How do you build accountability? Because if your risk profile still falls directly to the CEO, you will always default back to control as a logic mechanism. So you have to reorganize the risk of an organization and an institution in a really different way. It also requires a different form of storytelling with the world. If our public and citizens are still asking us to tell us what to do, and tell us what you want to do. So we're creating false manifestos of the future where we look 4 years' time, we're going to do this. And if our integrity is based on the doing, not in the integrity of how we're going to do, we will always fall back to command and control models. So this requires a systematic response in terms of the social contract of our institutions with citizens, and requiring we need to shift from what to the integrity of the how in really different formats. And that, I think, is a real transformation in our theory of democracy in practice. So with that, I will thank you, and I apologize if I have gone on too long in any format.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Indy. That was very inspiring. And I have the impression there's a lot to do for us. And for us as society in total and globally as well. But maybe just to pick on one thing. So you said we need a systemic reform, and this requires new organizational designs. So what would be your one recommendation? What could be a first and impactful first step really looking at organizational designs?
So, So I think one of the biggest challenges is risk, actually, weirdly enough, and operational risk, let alone kind of what I'd call external societal risks. So I think we have to transform, in order to move down this route, we have to recognize if you always concentrate risk at the level of the CEO, the administrator, then you effectively centralize your innovation capacity. If you centralize risk, you centralize innovation. It is de facto the truth. Right. And in order not to do that, I think you have to start to actually build a shared culture and conversation about how, as an organization, you want to manage risk. I know it sounds really boring and counterintuitive, but unless you can deal with that, I think risk at the point of failure, what will happen is the CEO will always get fired. Right. And that will make sure the next CEO, she will come in and she will control the system, because that's the only viable response. So I think we have to talk about organizational risk management in different ways. I know it's really crazy and boring. Then I think it is about actually culture and taxonomy and language. I think it's really fundamental we shift language. I'm really worried that our language is so predicated on objectifying, isolating, and control orientation. It requires different models. So I think that's key. I think then we have to also rebuild our relationship, our societal contract. So having a new form of documentation with the world is really format. So we have to build a new social contract. You know, if people keep saying, well, what can you tell us what you're going to do over the next 4 years? Yes, there are things you can plan, but actually more critical is not what commitments you make into a piece of paper over the next 4 years. More critical is the integrity of how you're going to make decisions and how you're organizing yourself. So we need a new type of relationship with citizens. And I think that's going to be really critical to be able to construct legitimacy. I could go on, but you get the feel of where I'm going.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's fascinating if you also, so we talk about organizations, but I mean, it's the same for individuals. And then since it's our policy day today, also for the ecosystem. And if you look at government, it's about how could we share or decentralize where we really create innovation, how we govern innovation, what languages do we need to speak so that we are able to collaborate among the different sectors. And also, I guess we need new contracts for new forms of innovation and for collaboration and co-creation.
Exactly. And just to build one thing that I didn't really say as much, I think it requires a new form of relationship. So our relationships, our procurement models, every form of relationship is based on a theory of optimization. I am going to optimize my position in relationship to you.
Sounds easy and very hard at the same time.
but you know what I mean? Procurement is always based on best value for who, right? So it's best value for the buyer. Now, I think what's problematic is that works in an idea of the world where you are seeing the world in objects and transacting. But actually, in a complex world, what you have to do is go from single point optimization, the contract, to relationships of care, which are fundamentally different, because they require us to recognize the co-beneficiary effects of what we optimize here to other things. That condition of care in relationship to the other. I know it's a soft word, but it's a different word. It's a word which is not about extraction and optimization. It's about being in relationship of care. That, I think, is a key component of the employment contract, the procurement contract, the partnering contract. All of these things, employment contracts are all designed around extraction and optimization. They're not really relationships and deep care. And I think you have to rechange the mindset.
Yes, thank you so much, Indy, for being here and sharing the presentation with us and your thoughts and also recommendation. Highly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Thank you.